The shift was slow and I was counting down the hours before I can call it quitting time and go home. The bar wasn't particularly busy that night. Mostly the same regulars nursing their drinks and telling the same stories, right? That's when she walked in. She was new, at least I hadn't seen her before, and she had this air about her, friendly but a bit intense. You get all sorts working at a dive bar, and she just seemed like someone looking for company. She ordered a drink and struck up a conversation. Nothing unusual. Small talk about the weather, asking how long I'd worked there, that kind of thing. She seemed nice enough, and honestly, I didn't mind the distraction. The night passed without much incident, and she left after a few hours. The next night she was back. This time, she was more talkative, asking about my hobbies, where I lived, whether I was single. I answered vaguely, not wanting to share too much, but she kept pressing. It was a bit awkward, but I chalked it up to her being lonely or just overly friendly. She started coming in every night after that, always sitting at the bar and always wanting to talk. It got to the point where she would wait for me to finish serving other customers, as if she expected my full attention. It was manageable. She wasn't rude or anything, just persistent. But then her questions got more personal, asking about my family, what I did on my days off, who I spent time with. I tried to keep things light, but it was starting to feel invasive. One night, as I was locking up, I noticed her outside, leaning against the wall. She said she was waiting to walk me home. I told her I was fine, but she insisted, saying it was dangerous at that hour. I managed to brush her off, but it left me feeling uneasy. The next night she was there again after closing, and the night after that. Things escalated when she started telling other customers that I was her boyfriend. I thought it was a joke, but she said it with such conviction that people believed her. One of the regulars even asked how long we'd been dating. I laughed it off, but inside I was fuming. I tried to talk to her about it, but she said it was obvious. We had a connection. That was the final straw. I told her she couldn't come back, that she was making me uncomfortable and crossing boundaries. She didn't take it well. She started yelling, calling me names, accusing me of leading her on. Then she started smashing glasses, knocking over chairs and shouting at the other customers. It was chaos. And then, just as suddenly as it started, she stopped. She stood there, breathing heavily, her face red with rage. And then she smiled. It was the calmest, eeriest smile I'd ever seen. She straightened her coat, picked up her bag, and walked out as if nothing had happened. I went to the petrol station on my way home just to fill up, the one on the corner by that old newsagent. As soon as I walked in, I saw her, the cashier. I'd seen her before, but never really paid attention. This time, though, I don't know what happened, but something about her just grabbed me. She was so beautiful, like unreal. I must have stood there for a minute, just staring at her, trying to figure out what to do. I was drawn in, like I couldn't look away, but then I thought, why not? Why not talk to her? I wasn't going to let a chance like this slip by. I took my time, filling up, asking her a few questions. Nothing too weird, just trying to make small talk. The way she looked at me, though, it was like I could tell she was interested too, at least that's what I thought. I started asking for her number, casually at first, but I wasn't going to leave without it. Not after what I felt. She hesitated for a moment, but then wrote it down. I could see the excitement in her eyes. She gave me a fake number, I'm sure of it, but at that moment I didn't care. I was on cloud nine. I smiled, paid for my petrol, even though I didn't really need it, and left. But then, an hour later, something felt off. I couldn't shake the thought of her, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Why the hell would she give me a fake number? After everything I'd done, after how we'd connected, I deserved better than that. She needed to know who she belonged to. She needed to understand that we were meant to be together. I jumped in my car, speeding back to the petrol station, furious. As soon as I arrived, I could see her behind the counter, oblivious to what was coming. My heart was pounding, my mind was racing. I stormed in, threw the door open, and immediately started telling her off. She looked surprised, of course she did, but I didn't care. I was done being nice. I yelled about the fake number, about how she had ruined everything. I was just trying to help her, to give her a chance, and she'd blown it. I made sure she understood. Then I started wrecking the store. I didn't care. The shelves, the counter, everything was fair game. I knocked things over, slammed the cash register open, and kicked over whatever was in my way. I could feel her eyes on me, but it didn't matter. She needed to see how serious I was. After a few minutes I left, but not before I made sure to remind her that we belonged together, that she'd made a mistake and she'd regret it. She wasn't going to get away from me that easily. When the police showed up, I was already on my way home. They called, but I didn't answer. They said they'd do what they could, but they couldn't stop me. I knew she'd regret it. She'd realize I was the only one who could make her happy. I haven't seen her since, but I know it's only a matter of time. She'll come around. They always do. You ever get that feeling when someone's watching you? Like no matter how hard you try to ignore it, there's this heavy weight of eyes on you burning into your skin. That's what I've been dealing with for weeks, and honestly, I think it's ruined me. I worked as a waitress at an all-night diner. The place always smells like grease and burnt coffee, with regulars who seem like they've been there since the dawn of time. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I liked the steady hum of life it brought in the quiet hours. But then he started coming in. I noticed him straight away. How could I not? He sat in the same corner booth every single night, well past midnight, ordering coffee he never touched. I thought he was just another insomniac looking for a place to sit. We get plenty of them, people who need somewhere to exist without being bothered. But he was different. He didn't bring a laptop or a book, didn't stare out the window or fiddle with his phone. He just watched, always at me. It started to get under my skin. He wasn't rude or anything. He never even spoke beyond ordering his coffee. But the way his eyes tracked my every move made my stomach twist. I tried to ignore it. But night after night, he kept showing up. Same booth, same routine. Last night, everything came to a head. It was a slow shift, just me and the cook in the back, and I'd been glancing at the clock every chance I got. The man was there, of course, sitting in his usual spot. I was trying not to look at him when I caught something in my peripheral vision. His head turning as I walked past, he was following me. By the time my shift ended, I was jumpy as hell. The diner's car park is poorly lit and always feels a bit dodgy, but I've never been outright scared walking to my car before. Last night was different. As I stepped out, I felt that familiar weight on my back, that same stare I'd felt in the diner. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him. He was standing just outside the diner, under the dim light of the sign, his face cast in shadows. For a moment I froze, then he started walking towards me. I don't remember making the decision to run, I just did. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My car was only a few spaces away, but it felt like miles. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them, but I managed to get the door open and slam it shut just as he reached me. He hit the window with his hand, hard enough that I thought the glass might shatter. Then he tried the handle, pulling on it like he could just rip the door open. I was shaking so much I could barely get the key in the ignition, but somehow I did. The engine roared to life and I slammed my foot on the accelerator, tearing out of the car park without even looking back. I didn't stop driving until I was halfway across town, parked in some random petrol station, trying to catch my breath. My hands were still shaking when I finally got home, and I don't think I slept at all last night. This morning I called my manager and quit. I can't do it anymore. I can't go back there. Can't risk seeing him again. I've already decided I'll never work nights again, not after this. I keep thinking about the look in his eyes as he slammed on my window. He didn't seem angry or frustrated. He looked excited. Like this was all part of some game I didn't know I was playing. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I'm terrified I'll see him again. So it started off like any other shift. I was working the late hours at the convenience store, just me and Kyle, my usual shift partner. But when I showed up, he wasn't there. Maybe he'd called in sick or something. He'd been complaining about feeling run down the last couple of days, so it wouldn't have been a surprise. But as I walked into the break room, I noticed his phone and keys were left on the table. That's when I started feeling uneasy. Kyle never leaves his stuff behind like that. He always checks his phone at least, even when we're busy. I thought maybe he'd stepped out for a bit, maybe grabbed a coffee or something, but after an hour of waiting, I started to get a bit worried. I went to check the back storage room. Our storage area is at the far end of the store, past all the shelves and aisles, and that's when I heard the noise. It was faint, like a scraping sound. I figured it was just the pipes or some other part of the building making noise, but then it came again. A thud, followed by something that sounded like a muffled groan. I don't know why, but my gut told me something wasn't right. I called out for Kyle, but there was no response. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and slowly walked towards the storage room. I reached the door and pushed it open. What I found made my heart stop. Kyle was in there, slumped against one of the shelves, his hands tied tightly behind his back. His face was pale, and he looked knocked out, cold. I rushed to him, panicking, but when I tried to wake him, he didn't respond. It was like he was in a deep sleep, or, God, I don't even want to think about it. But then I noticed something else that really freaked me out. There was no sign of a struggle. It was like he had just been placed there. His shoes were still on. His jacket was neatly folded beside him. There were no bruises, no cuts, nothing. Just him, unconscious and tied up like someone had carefully set him down there. I checked his pulse. He was still alive, thank God, but he wasn't coming to. I tried to call an ambulance, but when I pulled out my phone, it was dead. Of course, I thought, just my luck. I ran back to the counter to grab the landline, but as soon as I picked it up, the dial tone sounded different. It was like there was some kind of interference, static on the line. I hung up, panicking, and immediately went back to Kyle. I shook him again, trying to get a response, but nothing. It felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes before Kyle finally started to stir. His eyes flickered open, and he looked confused, like he didn't know where he was. I asked him what happened, but he just kept staring at me blankly. He said he couldn't remember anything, how he ended up in the storage room, how he got tied up, or even what had happened before. He didn't even seem to recognize where he was, as if he'd just woken up from a dream. I helped him to his feet, but he was shaky, so I had to support him. We both agreed we needed to get out of there, so I called the manager. Again, nothing on the phone, just static. I looked around the store, but everything was still, just as it always was. No signs of anyone else, but it felt wrong, and the longer I stayed there, the more I felt like something was watching us. Eventually, Kyle managed to stand up and move a bit better, though he was still out of it. We decided to leave. I didn't stick around. We left the store as fast as we could. I drove Kyle to the hospital, but he still couldn't remember a thing. Not how he ended up in the storage room, not how he was tied up, nothing. It's like he was blank, like whatever happened to him had wiped his memory clean. You know how sometimes you have one of those nights where nothing feels right, but you can't put your finger on why? That's how my shift started, and I wish I'd trusted my gut and just went home early. I work as a security guard at this big corporate office building. It's dead quiet at night, just me, the monitors and the air conditioning. I usually just sit in the security room, watch the CCTV footage and get through my shift. Nothing ever really happens. The building's always empty at night, and most of the time I'm left alone to get on with my job. But this night was different. Around 2 a.m., I noticed something strange on one of the CCTV cameras, a blur like a shadow moving through one of the hallways. I thought I was just imagining things, maybe the camera was glitching. But then I saw it again. A quick flash, something moving just out of view. I figured maybe it was a bug or something messing with the camera feed, but as the night went on, I kept noticing it. More movement, more shadows in the hallways that didn't make sense. I zoomed in on the cameras and checked the building map, but nothing was showing up as abnormal. The building was supposed to be empty. I couldn't let it go. I was getting more and more unsettled, so I decided to go out and have a quick look. Maybe someone had snuck in somehow. I grabbed my flashlight and checked the halls, making sure to stick to the security routes. The building was silent, the lights flickered overhead, and I started to feel like I was being watched. But when I checked the corridors, there was no one there. Not a soul. I went to a few other floors, checked the stairwells and bathrooms, but still no one, just the occasional creak of the building settling. I started to feel stupid, like I was overreacting, so I went back to the security room to check the cameras again. That's when things took a turn. Every single feed was static. No images, no video, just a blank screen with a buzzing noise. I tried switching cameras, but the static didn't go away. I checked the controls, but nothing seemed out of place. My heart was starting to race. I knew I hadn't messed with anything, and the equipment was in perfect working order earlier. I was about to get up and check the system when I heard a loud bang. I froze, trying to locate the sound, but it wasn't coming from any of the hallways. It was coming from the door to the security room. Someone was knocking hard. I was too scared to move, but I slowly stood up and walked over to the door, trying to calm myself. I peered through the small peephole, but all I could see was darkness. No shadow, no figure, nothing. I turned back to the monitors, but Now all the screens were flickering, the static was gone, and the footage had returned, except it was all wrong. The cameras showed the hallways, but the footage was of me. It was showing my own reflection walking around the building. I felt my stomach drop. How could that be? I was here, in the security room, watching the screens. But the footage showed me walking down the hallway, and there were figures now. Dark, twisted shapes, standing just behind me in the footage. Then I heard the banging again, this time louder, more insistent. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I turned back to the door. The sound wasn't just knocking now. It was like someone was trying to break the door down. I couldn't take it any longer. I had to leave, but the door felt like it was locked from the other side. The security room, once so familiar, now felt like a trap. I turned to the cameras one last time, but the footage had shifted again. This time the hallway was filled with people, hundreds of them, all watching me from the screens. They weren't moving, just standing there, staring at me. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. The room was spinning. I turned to grab my radio to call for help, but as I did, I heard something I'll never forget, a voice, soft and breathless, coming from right behind me. That's when I knew I was never alone. You won't believe what happened to me at work tonight. I'm still shaking from it. It was just meant to be a normal shift. The mall's always quiet after closing time, but I've worked there for years, so it doesn't bother me. But tonight was different. It all started with a mix-up in the schedule. I was meant to finish at 10, but when I went to clock out, the system wouldn't let me. Said I wasn't supposed to leave yet, that I had another 2 hours to go. I checked my phone, checked the schedule, nothing made sense. The office was locked and the security desk was empty. I tried calling the manager, but got no answer. I thought maybe I'd just been forgotten, so I went to check with security, but no one was around, just silence. It felt off, but I brushed it aside, figuring it was just a small oversight. It happens. But the thing is, the longer I walked around, the more things started to feel wrong. The lights were dimmed, the sound of the air conditioning seemed louder, and I couldn't shake this feeling like I was being watched. I shrugged it off as paranoia. After all, I've been working in that mall for years, so what's there to be scared of? I headed back to the janitor's closet to grab my mop and bucket, but when I went to open the door, it didn't open. I pushed harder, pulled, kicked, nothing. I checked the windows, locked, and that's when I realized the mall was still locked down. I was trapped. I don't know how long it was before I started hearing noises. I thought it was just the creaking of the building settling, maybe the wind rattling the doors, but then I started hearing footsteps. Slow footsteps that seemed to follow me from one side of the mall to the other. I'd turn a corner, hear them stop, and then start again when I did. It wasn't just footsteps anymore. The sound of whispering started. It was faint like a hum in the background, but it grew louder, like someone was talking right behind me. I couldn't make out the words, just low murmurs that sent shivers down my spine. I tried shouting, tried banging on the walls, but no one responded. I ran to the nearest exit and tried to open the door, but the handles wouldn't budge. I tried again, and then I heard a voice behind me. It wasn't loud, but it was there, and it was enough to freeze me in my tracks. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I don't know what I expected, but I turned slowly, and that's when I saw them, shadows moving against the walls, blurry figures that shifted and melted into the darkness. They weren't human, I knew that. Their shapes twisted unnaturally. The mall felt too large and too quiet for the things that I could feel but couldn't see. I went to the security room, thinking if anyone was watching the cameras, they might see me, might help. But when I sat in front of the monitors, everything went black. No signal, just static. The whispers grew louder. I could hear them clearly now. Unintelligible voices all around me. My pulse was racing. I ran, moving as fast as I could, through empty hallways, past shuttered stores, and that's when I heard something I didn't expect, the laughter. It wasn't a human laugh, though. It was hollow, echoing, like something pretending to be a laugh, but doing it wrong. By the time I got to the back doors, they were locked too. I tried all the exits, all of them. Nothing worked. It was like the whole building had turned against me. That's when I realized, whoever else is in this mall, they didn't want me to leave. They were toying with me, letting me think I had a chance, only to pull it away every time. I don't know how long it took before I found a way out, but I remember my hands shaking when I finally got to the loading dock. The doors were open just a crack, enough for me to squeeze through. As I crawled out into the night air, I looked back. The mall was dark, completely silent. I still don't understand what happened. I don't know if it was all in my head or if something else is in there waiting, but I do know one thing. I'm not going back in there again, not after that. Something's wrong with that place. I thought I'd get some rest tonight, but now I'm just too on edge. I keep thinking about those whispers, about those shadows, about how I barely escaped, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever it was, it's still there. This one's a bit of a weird one. You might not know how it is working at a 24-hour diner, but it's the kind of place that's always open, no matter what time it is, no matter who walks through the door, we will cook for you. And it's mostly just truckers and drunks at the odd hour, the kind of folks who grab a bite after a long drive or before heading back out. I was the short order cook, so I spent most of my time behind the grill, flipping burgers, frying eggs, all that stuff. One night I had this customer who came in around 2 a.m., a bloke who looked a bit out of place for the diner. He was older, dressed in a suit, not the kind of guy you'd expect to see slumming it in a greasy spoon. Anyway, he sat down at the counter, didn't even look at the menu, just stared straight ahead. I thought nothing of it. Some people just like their quiet, you know. I served him his coffee, made him a little breakfast he ordered, and expected him to be one of those quick eaters who'd pay and leave. But he didn't. He didn't touch his food, didn't move an inch, just sat there staring into space. Now, I've seen all sorts of people in that diner, but this felt off. It was like he was waiting for something, just staring ahead, not even blinking. As the hours passed, it started to get uncomfortable. He didn't eat a thing. He didn't speak to anyone. And the weird part, every time I looked over, his eyes were still fixed on the same spot, his head perfectly still, like he hadn't moved at all. I tried to ignore it, kept myself busy in the kitchen, but the atmosphere in the diner started to change. Then around 4 a.m. things got stranger. I was plating up an order when I caught him out of the corner of my eye. He'd moved. He was standing up, but he wasn't facing me. He wasn't facing anyone. He was facing the wall, standing perfectly still, his back to the counter, just staring at the wall like he was waiting for something to happen. At this point, I started getting a real bad feeling in my gut. Something wasn't right. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it. I tried to make a joke of it. Turning to a regular who was sitting at the other end of the counter, I said something like, "Got a weird one tonight, huh?" But the regular didn't even respond. I looked back at the man, and that's when it really hit me. He wasn't breathing. He hadn't moved. Not once, not a single sign of life for over 2 hours. That was when I knew I had to do something, but I was frozen. I don't know why, I just felt like if I moved, if I approached him, something awful would happen. So I did the only thing I could think of. I ignored him. I kept cooking, kept serving the other customers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this bloke was watching me. I kept looking over, catching glimpses of him, still standing by the wall, not blinking, not moving. It was like time itself had slowed down around him. Finally, when the clock hit 6 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. He'd been in the diner for nearly 4 hours, not eating, not leaving. I was done with it. I had to tell him to leave. But just as I started walking over, I heard a noise from the back door, like a thud, and when I turned around, the man was gone. No footsteps, no sound of him leaving, nothing. I went to the front door to check the street, but he wasn't outside either. I couldn't even see his car in the parking lot. It was like he'd just vanished into thin air. I don't know what happened that night, but I know one thing. I've never seen that man again, and I never want to. Funny thing is, I went to check the CCTV footage the next day just to see if I'd missed something. But all the footage for that night, blank, static, not a single frame of that customer sitting at the counter, not even a hint that he was ever there. I don't know what happened that night, and I don't know what he wanted, but something tells me I don't want to find out. It's one of those stories you never tell anyone, because once you do, it's like you've invited whatever it was into your life. I always thought working retail was just a grind, annoying, exhausting, but ultimately harmless. I never imagined it could leave me scared to leave my own house. It started about 2 weeks ago during a particularly busy shift at the department store where I work. You know the type of day, queues stretching down the aisles, customers complaining about everything from the prices to the music on the speakers. I was already frazzled when he came to my till. He was middle-aged, scruffy looking. With this angry energy rolling off him, he threw his items onto the counter and barely made eye contact as I rang them up. Everything seemed fine at first, just another grumpy customer until I told him the total. He exploded, accusing me of overcharging him, insisting that the prices were wrong. I tried to explain, to keep calm and professional, but he wouldn't let it go. His voice got louder, his face redder, and I swear everyone in the shop stopped to stare. My manager eventually had to step in, but even then he kept shouting, throwing around threats and insults. Finally he stormed out, but not before giving me this look. It wasn't just angry, it was personal. His eyes locked onto mine, and it felt like he was committing my face to memory. I tried to shake it off, told myself I'd forget about it by the end of the day. I was wrong. I noticed him was a few nights later as I was walking to my car after closing up. The car park was nearly empty, just a few scattered vehicles under dim lights. And there he was, leaning against a lamp post near the edge of the lot. I froze, but he didn't move, just stood there staring at me. I quickly got in my car and drove off, heart pounding the whole way home. Then it happened again, and again. Every night for a week he was there. Sometimes he'd stand near the entrance, other times closer to my car. He never approached me, never said anything, but his presence was enough to fill me with dread. I tried to tell my manager, but what could they do? He wasn't technically doing anything wrong, and I couldn't prove he was following me. I started asking co-workers to walk me to my car, but even then I could feel his eyes on me from across the lot. The worst night was when I finished late after an inventory check. It was well past midnight, and most of the staff had already gone home. I stepped out into the car park, and there he was, standing directly under a street lamp. The light cast deep shadows across his face, but I could still see his grin. I rushed to my car, not even looking back, and sped out of there as fast as I could. Since then, I've started taking alternate routes home, parking in different spots, doing everything I can to throw him off. But I can't shake the feeling that he's still watching me. I handed in my notice yesterday. I can't keep doing this. It's not just the fear of seeing him, it's the constant paranoia, the way I jump at every shadow and second-guess every stranger. I don't know what he wants or why he's doing this, but I'm terrified he won't stop. And I can't help but wonder what happens if he decides to follow me somewhere else. You ever have one of those moments where something seems off, but you can't quite put your finger on why? That happened to me the other night, and I wish I'd trusted my gut from the start. I work in retail, overseeing the self-checkout machines at a supermarket. It's not exactly thrilling work, but it pays the bills. Most of the time, my shifts are uneventful, helping people scan their fruit, explaining how the machine works to someone who's clearly never used one before, that kind of thing. But then there's the late shifts, when the place is nearly empty. That's when it gets weird. A few nights ago, I noticed a man at one of the machines. He wasn't someone I recognized, but that's not unusual. We get all sorts passing through. What caught my eye was the way he was scanning things. He'd pick up an item, hold it over the scanner, and then just put it in his bag. No beep, no payment, nothing. I thought it might be a glitch. That happens sometimes. The machines can be temperamental. I walked over to him, ready to help, but as I got closer, I realized he wasn't trying to scan anything. He was just miming it, like he was going through the motions without actually intending to pay. When I confronted him, he turned to look at me and smiled. Not an apologetic or embarrassed smile, but this weird, knowing grin that made my skin crawl. Then, without a word, he walked away, leaving his half-empty basket on the machine. I didn't know what to think. Maybe he was trying to mess with me, or maybe he was just strange. Either way, I was glad to see him leave. Or so I thought. Hours later, toward the end of my shift, I went to the break room for a quick breather. The store was quiet, and I figured I'd have a few minutes to myself before the next rush of late-night shoppers. But as I opened the door, my heart stopped. He was there. The same man, sitting casually in one of the chairs, like he belonged there. He looked up at me, still wearing that same unnerving smile, and said he'd been waiting for me. I froze. My brain couldn't make sense of it. How had he gotten back in? Why was he in the break room? My first instinct was to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. He didn't move, just sat there smiling at me like we were old friends. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I managed to back out of the room and slam the door shut. I ran to find my manager, but by the time we came back, the break room was empty. He was gone. I swear I've never been as freaked out as I was that night. You know how it is working the night shift in a warehouse, right? It's quiet, you're just doing your rounds, checking inventory, and staring at the clock, waiting for it to tick over. It's a boring job, but it pays the bills. So I've been working at this warehouse for a while, covering the night shift. It's always dead at that time, just me, the shelves of boxes, and the hum of the lights. Nothing ever really happens. Well, at least I thought nothing happened. A couple of weeks ago, I started noticing something odd. You know the inventory system, right? We keep track of everything coming in and out, but lately some things were missing or misplaced. I thought it was just me being forgetful, but it started happening more often. I'd check the stock and items would be off the list, things like tools, packaging supplies, small electronics. Nothing too major, but it was weird. I figured maybe the morning shift was messing up or that there was an error in the system. But then I realized something even stranger. When I checked the CCTV cameras, sometimes there were flashes of movement. After seeing it a few times, I couldn't ignore it. One night, I decided to investigate. I walked around the warehouse, checking the aisles, looking for any signs of someone sneaking in or out. The place was silent, the only sound being my boots on the concrete floor. I went into the back storage room where we kept the extra stock, and that's when I noticed there were fresh footprints in the dust. Clear, muddy tracks leading from one of the back doors that wasn't used much. Now, at this point, I started to panic a bit. I'd been working alone for hours and hadn't seen anyone come in. So I decided to follow the prints, thinking maybe I was just overthinking things. But the tracks led to a stack of pallets at the far end of the warehouse. When I pulled them apart, my heart nearly stopped. Behind the pallets, there was a little space, a small hidden area, and there, in the dark, were blankets and a few personal belongings. Clothes, toiletries, and a half-eaten meal. I felt this cold rush of dread wash over me. Someone had been living in the warehouse. They had been sneaking in at night, taking supplies and hiding out there. I stood there for a moment trying to figure out what to do next. But that's when I heard a noise from behind me. It was soft at first, just a slight shuffle, like someone moving carefully across the floor. I spun around, but there was no one there. I started to feel like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't want to stick around and wait to see who it was, so I decided to head to the security office and check the cameras. But as I walked through the aisles, I noticed something even worse. The lights flickered above me. I could hear faint whispers echoing in the corners of the warehouse. My pace quickened, and I broke into a jog. When I got to the security office, I checked the cameras again, only to find that all the footage was static. The screen was blank. I had a terrible feeling I wasn't alone anymore. I grabbed my phone to call someone, but just as I pulled it out, the office door slammed shut. I froze. The lock clicked. I ran to the door, tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I started banging on the door, screaming for help, but there was no response. The only sound was my own breath, shallow and panicked. Then I heard something else, a dragging sound, something heavy scraping against the floor outside the door. I knew someone was out there, someone who knew I had found them. After what felt like hours, the door suddenly creaked open. I didn't wait to see who it was. I just ran. I bolted out of the office, down the aisles, through the back doors, and straight into the parking lot. I didn't stop until I was in my car, locked inside, my hands shaking on the wheel. I never went back to that warehouse. They offered me a transfer to another site, but even that didn't feel safe. I don't know if anyone still works there at night, but I know one thing for sure. Someone was living in that building, and I don't think they ever left.